There was an island in the Caribbean where the laws of civilization did not apply, where murderers and thieves built their own society and made their own rules, where a man could drink himself to death or become fabulously wealthy, and no king or governor could say otherwise. The island was shaped like a sea turtle, which is how it got its name Tortuga, and for nearly a century it served as the capital of Caribbean piracy, a place where the most dangerous men in the Atlantic world gathered to spend their plunder and plan their next voyages. The buccaneers who called Tortuga home terrorized Spanish shipping from Florida to Venezuela, capturing treasure ships loaded with the wealth of the Americas and bringing it back to an island where everything was for sale. They created something unprecedented in the New World, a republic of rogues that governed itself through customs and agreements rather than royal decrees, a democracy of the damned where a man's worth was measured by his courage and his cunning rather than his birth. The gold they captured has been scattered to the winds of history, spent in the taverns and brothels of the island, or lost in shipwrecks that dot the Caribbean floor. But the legend of Tortuga endures, the memory of a time when pirates ruled their own kingdom and answered to no one. If you're settling in for the night, this is exactly the kind of story that works perfectly for sleep. An island of outcasts, treasure beyond counting, battles on the high seas, and a world that operated by rules entirely different from our own. If you enjoy it, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into forgotten history. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, drop a comment. I love knowing that someone in the Caribbean where this story unfolded, and someone in Europe where the empires plotted, and someone on the other side of the world are all drifting off to the same dreams of pirate islands together. Now let's go back nearly 400 years, to an age when the Caribbean was the most contested water on Earth, and one small island became the centre of a pirate empire. The island that would become the pirate capital of the Caribbean lies just off the northern coast of Hispaniola, separated from the larger island by a narrow channel that provided both access and protection. Tortuga is small, perhaps 25 miles long, and no more than 5 miles wide, a rocky, mountainous landmass that rises steeply from the sea. The terrain is rugged, covered in dense forest that in the 17th century provided timber for ships and cover for men who wished to remain hidden. The southern coast, facing Hispaniola, offered the harbours and anchorages that ships required, natural bays where vessels could shelter from storms and where the business of piracy could be conducted away from prying eyes. The northern coast was more exposed, steep cliffs dropping into the sea, less hospitable but also less accessible to enemies who might wish to land troops and reclaim the island for civilization. The name Tortuga comes from the Spanish word for turtle, a reference to the island's shape when viewed from the sea. Spanish explorers were the first Europeans to encounter the island, mapping it as they mapped the rest of the Caribbean in the decades following Columbus's voyages. But Spain showed little interest in settling Tortuga itself. The island was too small, too rocky, too lacking in the gold and silver that drove Spanish colonization elsewhere. The Spanish established their presence on the larger island of Hispaniola, building the city of Santo Domingo and developing plantations that would exploit the land and the labour of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples. Tortuga they left alone, a minor feature on the maps they were drawing of their new empire, not worth the effort of settlement when greater prizes awaited elsewhere. The neglect that Spain showed toward Tortuga created the opportunity that others would exploit. In the early 17th century, French and English adventurers began to drift into the Caribbean, seeking their own fortunes in waters that Spain claimed but could not fully control. Some came as traders, hoping to profit from commerce with Spanish colonies that were forbidden to trade with foreigners. Some came as settlers, establishing small colonies on islands that Spain had ignored. And some came as hunters, pursuing the wild cattle and pigs that roamed the forests of Hispaniola and the surrounding islands, animals descended from livestock that Spanish settlers had introduced and that had multiplied in the absence of natural predators. These hunters would become the first permanent European residents of Tortuga, and they would give the island its distinctive character long before it became famous for piracy. The hunters who settled on Tortuga and the northern coast of Hispaniola were called buccaneers, a name derived from the boucan, the wooden frame on which they smoked the meat they harvested. The boucan was a technique learned from the indigenous Taino people, a method of preserving meat that allowed the hunters to prepare provisions for ships that needed food for long voyages. The buccaneers lived rough lives in the forests, hunting the wild cattle and pigs with long muskets, skinning the animals and smoking the meat, selling their products to passing ships in exchange for gunpowder, cloth, and other necessities. They were outcasts from European society, men who had fled debt or crime, or simply the constraints of civilization, finding in the wilderness of the Caribbean a freedom that the Old World could not provide. They lived by their own rules, forming partnerships and alliances that substituted for the families and communities they had left behind. The transition from hunting to piracy was gradual and almost inevitable, driven by the economics of the Caribbean and the hostility of the Spanish. The buccaneers who sold provisions to passing ships learned the rhythms of maritime commerce, the routes that ships followed, and the cargoes they carried. They acquired boats to pursue their trade, small vessels that could navigate the coastal waters and approach ships at anchor. And they discovered that the Spanish, who claimed the entire Caribbean as their exclusive domain, viewed them as trespassers to be driven out by force. Spanish expeditions attacked the buccaneer settlements on Hispaniola, killing the hunters and burning their camps, trying to eliminate the foreign presence that had established itself in their territory. The buccaneers responded in kind, first defending themselves and then taking the offensive, attacking Spanish ships and settlements in a cycle of violence that would continue for decades. The conversion of the buccaneers from hunters to pirates was accelerated by the arrival of more organized leadership and by the strategic interests of European powers who saw in the pirates a useful weapon against Spain. England and France were rivals of Spain, competing for territory and trade in the New World, and they recognized that the buccaneers could serve their purposes without requiring direct investment or responsibility. By issuing letters of marque, commissions that authorized private ships to attack enemy commerce in wartime, the colonial governors transformed pirates into privateers, giving them legal cover for activities that were otherwise criminal. The distinction between privateer and pirate was always thin, and many captains moved freely between legal and illegal predation depending on circumstances. But the official sanction mattered, providing a framework within which the buccaneers could operate with some assurance that they would not be hanged if captured. Tortuga emerged as the centre of buccaneer activity because of its geography and its political ambiguity. The island was close enough to Hispaniola to serve as a base for operations against Spanish settlements, but it was separated from the Spanish strongholds by waters that made attack difficult. The harbours on the southern coast could shelter a fleet, and the mountains of the interior provided refuge if enemies landed. Most importantly, Tortuga was outside the effective control of any European power, a no-man's land where different rules applied. The French claimed the island intermittently, appointing governors who exercised nominal authority. But the real power lay with the buccaneers themselves, who accepted or rejected governors as it suited their purposes. The island became a magnet for men who wanted to live outside the law, a gathering place for the ambitious and the desperate from every nation that sailed the Caribbean. The society that developed on Tortuga was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the 17th century world, a rough democracy of violence and commerce that anticipated later ideals of equality and self-governance. The buccaneers organized themselves into companies, groups of men who agreed to sail together and share the profits of their voyages. The companies elected their captains, choosing leaders based on skill and reputation, rather than birth or appointment. The captain's authority was significant but not absolute. He commanded during battle and made tactical decisions, but major questions were decided by vote of the entire company. The distribution of plunder followed rules that were agreed upon before each voyage, with specified shares for the captain, officers, and common sailors, and compensation for those who were injured in combat. These agreements, sometimes written and sometimes customary, formed a kind of constitution for each voyage, a contract that bound the participants together and defined their rights and obligations. The system of compensation for injuries was particularly remarkable, a form of disability insurance that provided for men who lost limbs or suffered other permanent damage in the course of their dangerous work. A man who lost his right arm might receive 600 pieces of 8 or 6 slaves, the equivalent of a substantial fortune. A man who lost a leg might receive 500 pieces of 8 or 5 slaves. Lesser injuries were compensated at lesser rates, the scale reflecting both the severity of the loss and the value that the buccaneer community placed on the men who risked everything in their common enterprise. This system of compensation recognized that piracy was dangerous work, that the men who engaged in it were risking their bodies as well as their lives, and that the community had an obligation to care for those who suffered in its service. Nothing comparable existed in the legitimate navies or merchant fleets of the time, where injured sailors were typically discharged without compensation to beg or starve. The governance of Tortuga itself reflected the same democratic principles that operated aboard the buccaneer ships. The governors who nominally ruled the island did so only with the consent of the buccaneer population, and those who tried to impose unpopular policies were driven out or killed. The real authority lay in the customs and agreements that the buccaneers had developed among themselves, unwritten laws that everyone understood and that were enforced by collective action rather than by courts and police. Disputes were settled by arbitration or by combat, depending on the nature of the conflict and the preferences of the parties. Property rights were respected within the community, theft from a fellow buccaneer being punished severely, but the property rights of outsiders, especially Spanish outsiders, did not exist. The morality of Tortuga was the morality of an outlaw community, internal solidarity combined with external predation, loyalty to comrades and hostility to everyone else. The economy of Tortuga was built on plunder, the systematic theft of Spanish wealth that flowed through the Caribbean in quantities that staggered the imagination. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was the richest colonial enterprise in history, extracting gold and silver from mines in Mexico and Peru that seemed inexhaustible. The treasure was shipped across the Atlantic in annual fleets, convoys of galleons that carried the wealth of continents back to Spain. The treasure fleets were tempting targets, their cargoes worth fortunes to anyone who could capture them, but they were also well defended, escorted by warships that made direct attack extremely dangerous. The buccaneers of Tortuga rarely attacked the main treasure fleets directly. Instead, they preyed on the smaller ships that fed into the system, the coastal traders and individual galleons that carried goods between the ports of the Spanish Main. The Spanish Main, the Caribbean coastline of Central and South America, was the hunting ground where the Tortuga buccaneers made their fortunes. The ports of this coast, from Cartagena to Portobello to Veracruz, were the collection points for the wealth of the Americas, places where silver from the mines and goods from the plantations were gathered for shipment to Spain. Ships loaded with treasure sailed from these ports, following routes that were well known and predictable, vulnerable to attackers who knew when and where to strike. The buccaneers developed intelligence networks that informed them of ship movements and cargo manifests, gathering information from spies, from captured sailors, and from the corruption that was endemic in Spanish colonial administration. A well-informed captain could position himself to intercept a rich prize, striking before the victim knew danger was near and escaping before Spanish warships could respond. The prizes that the buccaneers captured varied enormously in value, from small coastal traders worth only a few hundred pieces of eight to great ships carrying cargoes that could make every man aboard wealthy for life. A typical voyage might take several small prizes, accumulating plunder gradually over weeks or months of cruising. An exceptional voyage might capture a single ship whose cargo exceeded anything the hunters had ever seen. Bars of silver and chests of coins that had to be weighed rather than counted. The most famous buccaneer captures became legendary, stories told and retold in the taverns of Tortuga, inspiring new generations of hunters to try their luck on the Spanish Main. The possibility of sudden wealth was the great attraction of the buccaneer life. The chance that a single voyage might transform a penniless sailor into a man of fortune might provide the capital to retire from the dangerous trade and live comfortably for the rest of his days. The spending of this wealth was concentrated on Tortuga, which became a marketplace for everything that the buccaneers needed and wanted. Merchants established themselves on the island, importing goods from Europe and the other Caribbean colonies, setting up shops and warehouses to serve the buccaneer trade. The prices on Tortuga were high, reflecting the risks of doing business in a pirate haven and the free spending of men who had no reason to save for the future. Rum flowed freely. The distilled spirit that was the Caribbean's signature product, consumed in quantities that would kill ordinary men but that the buccaneers drank as casually as water. The taverns of Tortuga were famous throughout the Caribbean, places of legendary debauchery where men who had risked their lives could spend their earnings on drink, and women and whatever other pleasures money could buy. The prostitution that flourished on Tortuga was another industry built on buccaneer wealth, women imported from Europe or the other colonies to serve men who had few other opportunities for female companionship. The buccaneers were overwhelmingly male, their society shaped by the absence of women and the consequent absence of families and domestic life. Some buccaneers formed relationships with women on Tortuga or in the ports they visited, relationships that might be temporary transactions or might develop into something more permanent. Some captains brought their wives or mistresses on voyages, though this was unusual and sometimes forbidden by the articles that governed pirate ships. The general pattern was one of brief encounters purchased with plunder, women providing services that the men desired and that their money could buy. The morality of these arrangements was not questioned within the buccaneer community. It was simply how things were done, part of the economy that piracy had created. The gambling that consumed another portion of buccaneer wealth was equally endemic, games of chance that could transfer a fortune in a single night. The buccaneers gambled on cards, on dice, on anything that could produce a random outcome and justify a wager. Men who had captured thousands of pieces of eight might lose everything before they left Tortuga, their share of the plunder passing to luckier or more skillful players. The volatility was part of the culture, the acceptance that wealth was temporary and that tomorrow might bring poverty or death. The attitude toward money reflected the broader fatalism of men who lived by violence and who knew that their next voyage might be their last. Why save for a future that might never come when the pleasures of the present were available and the means to purchase them in hand? The ships that the buccaneers sailed were as varied as the men who crewed them, ranging from small boats suitable only for coastal raiding to full-sized warships capable of engaging Spanish galleons. The typical buccaneer vessel was smaller and faster than the ships it preyed upon, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than for cargo capacity or heavy armament. The preference for fast ships reflected the buccaneer tactics of ambush and pursuit, rather than pitched battle. A buccaneer captain wanted to overtake his prey, not to exchange broadsides with it. He wanted to board and capture, taking the ship and cargo intact rather than sinking them in combat. The ideal prize was one that could be taken with minimal fighting, a ship whose crew surrendered when faced with overwhelming force, rather than one that resisted and had to be subdued at the cost of lives and damage. The armament that the buccaneers carried reflected this preference for boarding over bombardment. The ships mounted cannon, typically smaller pieces that could fire rapidly and that were useful for disabling a fleeing prey, but the main weapons were the small arms that the buccaneers carried into close combat. The muskets that had served for hunting wild cattle were equally effective against human targets, and the buccaneers were famous for their marksmanship, able to pick off officers and helmsmen from distances that left their opponents helpless. The pistols that every buccaneer carried provided firepower for the chaos of boarding, weapons that could be fired once and then used as clubs in the hand-to-hand fighting that followed. The cutlasses and axes that completed the buccaneer arsenal were designed for the close quarters of ship-to-ship combat, short enough to be wielded in confined spaces and heavy enough to deliver killing blows. The tactics that the buccaneers developed were refined over decades of practice, techniques for capturing ships that minimized risk while maximizing profit. The preferred approach was to attack at dawn, when the target crew would be groggy from sleep and when the rising sun could blind defenders trying to see the approaching threat. The buccaneers would close rapidly, their fast ships overtaking the heavier prey, and would sweep the deck with musket fire to clear the way for boarding. The psychological impact of the attack was often decisive. Crews that saw armed men swarming over their sides, shooting and cutting down anyone who resisted, frequently surrendered rather than face the slaughter that resistance would bring. The buccaneers encouraged this tendency by cultivating a reputation for mercy toward those who surrendered quickly, and for brutal treatment of those who resisted. The reputation was a weapon in itself, persuading rational captains that submission was wiser than heroism. The treatment of prisoners varied depending on circumstances and on the temperament of the capturing captain. Those who surrendered promptly were generally well treated, relieved of their valuables and their cargo, but allowed to live and often provided with food and water for their journey to safety. Officers might be held for ransom, their wealthy families or their governments expected to pay for their release. Sailors might be invited to join the buccaneer crew, an offer that some accepted willingly and others accepted as an alternative to less pleasant fates. Those who resisted were treated harshly, the buccaneers making examples that would encourage future victims to surrender. The stories of buccaneer cruelty that circulated through the Caribbean were partly propaganda, exaggerations designed to terrify, but they were also partly true, reflecting the violence that was inherent in the trade and that some captains employed systematically. The most famous of the buccaneer captains became legends in their own lifetimes, men whose names were known throughout the Caribbean and whose exploits were celebrated in the taverns of Tortuga. Henry Morgan was perhaps the greatest of them, a Welshman who rose from common sailor to commander of buccaneer fleets that attacked and captured major Spanish cities. Morgan's raid on Panama in 1671 was the high point of buccaneer audacity, an overland expedition that crossed the isthmus and sacked the richest city in the Americas. François l'Olonnais was the most feared, a Frenchman whose cruelty toward prisoners became legendary, a man who reportedly tore the living heart from a Spanish prisoner and bit into it to terrorize others into revealing hidden treasure. Roch Brasiliano was notorious for drunken rampages through the streets of Port Royal, a buccaneer whose violence was as likely to be directed at his own allies as at the Spanish. These men and dozens like them made Tortuga the centre of their world, the place where they recruited crews, outfitted ships, and spent the wealth they extracted from Spanish victims. The relationship between the buccaneers and the colonial governments that nominally sponsored them was complex and constantly shifting. The French governors of Tortuga sought to control and profit from the buccaneer trade, collecting fees and taxes in exchange for the protection and legitimacy that their commissions provided. The English governors of Jamaica, which became another major buccaneer base after 1655, pursued similar policies, authorizing privateering voyages against Spanish shipping and taking a percentage of the proceeds. The buccaneers accepted this arrangement when it suited them and ignored it when it did not, their loyalty available to whoever offered the best terms. The governments used the buccaneers as weapons against Spain, encouraging raids that they could officially deny responsibility for, and the buccaneers used the governments for the cover that official sanction provided. The relationship was one of mutual exploitation, each side taking what it could while maintaining a fiction of authority and obedience. Henry Morgan's career epitomized the possibilities and the contradictions of the buccaneer world, a life that took him from obscure origins to knighthood and the governorship of Jamaica. Morgan arrived in the Caribbean sometime in the 1650s, possibly as an indentured servant, and quickly found his way into the buccaneer trade. He demonstrated the qualities that success required: courage in combat, skill in leadership, and the ruthlessness to do whatever circumstances demanded. He rose through the ranks of the buccaneers, commanding larger and larger expeditions, developing a reputation for success that attracted men to serve under him. By the late 1660s, he was the most powerful buccaneer in the Caribbean, capable of assembling fleets of over 30 ships and armies of nearly 2,000 men, forces that could challenge not just individual ships but entire cities. Morgan's attack on Portobello in 1668 demonstrated his tactical genius and his willingness to attempt what others considered impossible. Portobello was one of the most heavily fortified ports on the Spanish Main, the collection point for Peruvian silver, and a target that the buccaneers had never dared to attack directly. Morgan approached overland, avoiding the harbour defences that would have destroyed any naval assault, and captured the city in a surprise attack that overwhelmed the defenders before they could organise resistance. The plunder was enormous, the ransom extracted from the citizens even larger, and Morgan returned to Jamaica with wealth that established his reputation as the greatest buccaneer of his age. The Spanish protested furiously, demanding that England punish the pirate who had attacked a city during peacetime. But the English government merely noted that Morgan had acted under commission from the Jamaican governor, and that the technical state of war made his actions legally defensible. The raid on Panama 3 years later was Morgan's masterpiece, an operation that pushed buccaneer ambitions to their absolute limit. Panama City was the richest prize in the Americas, the Pacific terminus of the treasure route that carried Peruvian silver across the isthmus for shipment to Spain. The city was protected by distance and terrain, the jungle and mountains of the isthmus forming barriers that seemed impassable for any attacking force. Morgan assembled over 1,000 men for the expedition, the largest buccaneer army ever gathered, and led them up the Chagres River and across the jungle in a march that tested the limits of human endurance. They arrived at Panama starving and exhausted, facing a Spanish force that outnumbered them, but the buccaneers attacked with the ferocity of desperation and routed the defenders. The city fell, the treasure was plundered, and Morgan returned across the isthmus with wealth that made his previous captures seem modest. The aftermath of the Panama raid marked a turning point in Morgan's career and in the history of Caribbean piracy. The Spanish government protested so vigorously that England could not ignore them, and the diplomatic situation required a gesture of good faith. Morgan was arrested and sent to England to face charges, a sacrifice to diplomatic necessity that seemed to signal the end of his career. But Morgan proved as skillful at political navigation as he had been at naval combat. He cultivated powerful friends, presented himself as a patriot who had served English interests rather than a criminal who had violated international law, and emerged from the legal process not as a condemned pirate, but as a knight of the realm. Sir Henry Morgan returned to Jamaica in 1674 as lieutenant governor, charged with suppressing the very piracy that had made his fortune. The transformation from buccaneer to establishment figure was complete, the outlaw made respectable by success and by the needs of the government he had served. François l'Olonnais represented a darker aspect of the buccaneer world, a man whose cruelty exceeded even the brutal norms of 17th century piracy. Born Jean David Nau in France, l'Olonnais came to the Caribbean as an indentured servant and worked his way into the buccaneer trade through a combination of skill and savagery. His hatred of the Spanish was personal and intense, reportedly stemming from brutal treatment during his years of servitude, and he expressed that hatred through violence that shocked even his fellow buccaneers. The stories of his cruelty became legendary. Prisoners tortured with burning matches, their flesh sliced away while they still lived, their hearts torn out and eaten as other prisoners watched. The stories may have been exaggerated, but they served a purpose, creating a reputation that terrified Spanish defenders and encouraged surrender rather than resistance. L'Olonnais' raid on Maracaibo in 1666 demonstrated both his military capabilities and his capacity for atrocity. He captured the city with a force of several hundred men, extracting ransom from the inhabitants and torturing those suspected of hiding valuables. The expedition yielded enormous plunder, but the methods used to obtain it left a reputation that would follow l'Olonnais for the rest of his life. His end was appropriately gruesome, captured by indigenous people on the coast of Central America and reportedly torn apart and eaten, a fate that seemed fitting for a man who had inflicted comparable suffering on others. The career of l'Olonnais illustrated the extremes that the buccaneer world could produce, the absence of external restraint allowing men of violent disposition to indulge their worst impulses without consequence. The French influence on Tortuga gave the island its distinctive character, a culture that blended the traditions of maritime France with the necessities of life on the outlaw frontier. The governors who France sent to Tortuga were charged with maintaining some semblance of order, while extracting what profit they could from the buccaneer trade. Some of these governors were capable administrators who built fortifications and established institutions that gave Tortuga a degree of stability. Others were corrupt opportunists who saw the governorship as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The best of them, men like Bertrand d'Ogeron, understood that governing buccaneers required accommodation rather than command, that the free men of Tortuga would accept leadership only from those who served their interests. Bertrand d'Ogeron governed Tortuga from 1665 to 1675, a decade that represented the peak of the island's prosperity and influence. D'Ogeron recognized that Tortuga needed a more diverse economy than piracy alone could provide, and he encouraged the development of plantation agriculture alongside the buccaneer trade. He recruited settlers from France, including women who could provide the families that would transform a camp of transient pirates into a stable community. He built fortifications that protected the harbour and the settlement, making Tortuga defensible against the Spanish expeditions that periodically attempted to recapture the island. He maintained relationships with the buccaneer captains that balanced their need for autonomy against his need for control, achieving a working arrangement that served both parties reasonably well. The women who came to Tortuga during d'Ogeron's governorship changed the social dynamics of the island in ways that had lasting effects. The buccaneers had lived as a bachelor society, their culture shaped by the absence of women and the rough camaraderie of men who had only each other for companionship. The arrival of women created opportunities for domestic life that had not existed before, the possibility of marriage and family that could anchor men to the island rather than sending them constantly back to sea. Some of the women were recruited voluntarily, attracted by the opportunity to escape the limited options available to poor women in France. Others were sent involuntarily, prostitutes and petty criminals whose banishment to the colonies was considered appropriate punishment for their offences. All of them found themselves in a world unlike anything they had known, where the normal rules did not apply and where their options were both more constrained and more open than they had been in Europe. The marriages that formed on Tortuga followed customs that would have been unrecognizable in France, informal arrangements that reflected the practical needs of the community rather than the legal requirements of European society. A buccaneer might purchase a wife, paying a set sum to the woman or to whoever had brought her to the island, and the marriage would be recognized by the community regardless of whether a priest had blessed it. The purchased wife had certain rights that the custom protected, including the right to keep whatever property she brought to the marriage if her husband died or abandoned her. The arrangements were transactional but not necessarily exploitative. In a world where women were scarce and male mortality was high, a woman who survived her husband might find herself with resources and opportunities that would have been impossible in the Old World. The religious life of Tortuga was minimal, the institutions of the Catholic Church having little presence in a community that lived by violating most of the commandments. Priests were rare on the island, and those who came often found their authority challenged by men who had rejected the social order that the Church represented. Some buccaneers maintained their faith despite their profession, attending Mass when it was available, and confessing their sins to whatever priest could be found. Others had abandoned religion entirely, seeing no contradiction between their skepticism and their occupation. The majority probably fell somewhere in between, nominally Catholic but practically indifferent, observing the forms of religion without allowing it to interfere with the business of piracy. The Church's teaching that stealing was sinful applied to stealing from fellow Christians, not from Spanish papists who were themselves the enemies of true religion. Such distinctions allowed men to maintain their faith while ignoring its inconvenient requirements. The languages spoken on Tortuga reflected the international character of the buccaneer community, French and English predominating, but Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, and various African languages also heard in the streets and taverns. The buccaneers developed their own vocabulary, specialized terms for the ships they sailed, the weapons they carried, the operations they conducted, and the plunder they captured. This vocabulary crossed linguistic boundaries, creating a shared language of piracy that men from different nations could understand. The multilingualism was practical necessity in a world where crews might include men of half a dozen nationalities, where prizes might be taken from ships of any flag, and where markets for stolen goods might be found in any port that would receive them. The ability to communicate across language barriers was a survival skill, and the buccaneers who prospered were often those who could negotiate in multiple tongues. The food that sustained the buccaneers was a blend of European, African, and indigenous traditions, adapted to the resources available in the Caribbean environment. The wild cattle and pigs that the original hunters had pursued remained important sources of protein. The smoked meat that gave the buccaneers their name still prepared and consumed on the island. The sea provided fish and shellfish in abundance, the Caribbean waters teeming with species that could be caught and eaten fresh or preserved for voyages. The plantations that developed on Tortuga and neighbouring Hispaniola produced tropical fruits, vegetables, and the cassava bread that was a staple of Caribbean diet. The ships that arrived from Europe and the other colonies brought foods that could not be produced locally. The salt beef and hardtack biscuits that were the standard provisions of maritime life, along with luxuries like cheese and wine for those who could afford them. The drink that lubricated social life on Tortuga was rum, the distilled spirit that the Caribbean sugar industry produced as a byproduct. Rum was cheap and abundant, far less expensive than the wines and brandies that Europeans preferred, and it could be produced locally rather than imported across the Atlantic. The buccaneers drank rum in quantities that would be considered dangerous by modern standards. Starting in the morning and continuing through the day, their tolerance built up through constant practice. The drinking was social, the taverns of Tortuga serving as meeting places where deals were made and crews were recruited, where news was shared and reputations were established. The drinking was also medicinal, or at least it was believed to be, the spirit thought to ward off the fevers and other diseases that plagued the Caribbean. And the drinking was simply pleasurable, one of the few entertainments available to men whose lives were otherwise characterized by hard work and danger. The music that filled the taverns of Tortuga was as international as the population, sailors from different nations contributing the songs and instruments of their homelands. The fiddle was common, its portable size making it practical for shipboard use, and the hornpipe dances that accompanied fiddle music were performed in the streets and taverns of the island. Drums of African origin provided rhythms that were unfamiliar to European ears, but that blended with European melodies to create something new. The songs that the buccaneers sang told stories of their trade, celebrating famous captains and successful voyages, mourning comrades who had died at sea or on the gallows. The music was participatory, everyone joining in the choruses, the singing growing louder as the rum flowed and the evening progressed. The music created community, binding together men from different backgrounds in shared experience and shared expression. The clothing that the buccaneers wore was practical rather than fashionable, designed for the demands of life at sea and in tropical climates. The loose trousers and shirts that were standard sailors' wear predominated, fabrics that allowed movement and that could withstand the salt and sun that wore out finer materials. The bare feet that many sailors preferred were common on Tortuga, shoes being impractical for climbing rigging and unnecessary in the warm Caribbean climate. But successful buccaneers often displayed their wealth through clothing, wearing captured finery that marked them as men of fortune. A captain might dress in silk and velvet taken from a Spanish prize, his appearance proclaiming his success as loudly as any words. The contrast between the rough clothing of ordinary sailors and the ostentatious display of wealthy captains was part of the visual culture of Tortuga, a constant reminder of what the buccaneer life might yield for those with skill and luck. The weapons that the buccaneers cherished were both tools of their trade and symbols of their identity. A good musket was a prized possession, carefully maintained and personalized with carvings or inlays that marked it as belonging to a particular owner. The pistols that every buccaneer carried were equally valued, their quality and number reflecting the status of their owner. The cutlass, the short heavy sword that was the characteristic weapon of Caribbean pirates, was designed for the close combat that boarding actions required, its single edge able to deliver devastating cuts in the confined spaces of ship-to-ship fighting. These weapons were displayed openly on Tortuga, carried in belts and baldricks that made them immediately accessible, their presence a constant reminder that this was a society where violence was the ultimate arbiter of disputes. The architecture of Tortuga was modest, the buildings constructed of local materials for practical purposes rather than for permanence or beauty. The fortifications that protected the harbour were the most substantial structures, stone walls and bastions built to resist Spanish attack and to project the power that made the buccaneer enterprise possible. The warehouses where plunder was stored and goods were traded were large wooden buildings, functional structures designed to hold the merchandise that passed through the island. The taverns and brothels that served the buccaneer population were smaller, simpler structures, their interiors more significant than their exteriors. The houses where permanent residents lived were modest dwellings, wood and thatch constructions that were adequate for the tropical climate and that could be rebuilt easily if destroyed by storm or fire. The impermanence of the architecture reflected the impermanence of the community itself, a society that knew it might not last and that did not invest in structures that assumed a future. The Spanish response to the buccaneer threat was persistent but largely ineffective, a combination of military expeditions and diplomatic protests that failed to eliminate the pirates who preyed on Spanish commerce. The Spanish attacked Tortuga repeatedly, landing troops who killed buccaneers and destroyed settlements, but they never held the island permanently. Each time the Spanish withdrew, the buccaneers returned, rebuilding what had been destroyed and resuming their operations. The cycle of attack and recovery demonstrated both the determination of the Spanish to eliminate the pirate haven and the resilience of the buccaneer community that called it home. The Spanish lacked the naval resources to maintain a permanent presence on Tortuga, while also defending their vast colonial empire, and the buccaneers exploited this weakness relentlessly. The diplomatic protests that Spain lodged with England and France were equally unavailing, the European powers finding the buccaneers too useful to suppress. The official position of France and England was that piracy was illegal and that those who engaged in it should be punished, but the actual policy was to encourage attacks on Spanish shipping while maintaining plausible deniability. The letters of marque that authorized privateering provided legal cover that Spain refused to recognize, and the colonial governors who issued them profited handsomely from the trade. When diplomatic pressure became intense, a token gesture might be made, a particularly notorious pirate arrested, or a commission revoked, but the fundamental system continued unchanged. The buccaneers served the strategic interests of powers that were happy to see Spain weakened, and their crimes were overlooked as long as they targeted the right victims. The treasure that flowed through Tortuga was extracted from the Spanish colonial economy, wealth that had been mined by enslaved indigenous peoples and later by enslaved Africans in conditions of brutal exploitation. The silver of Potosi and Mexico, the gold of Colombia and Peru, the gems of Brazil, All were targets for buccaneer capture, the concentrated wealth of the Americas passing through pirate hands on its way to European markets. The buccaneers did not create the exploitation that produced this wealth, but they profited from it, their activities part of a larger system of colonial extraction that shaped the Atlantic world. The moral position of the buccaneers was ambiguous. They stole from thieves, took from those who had taken first, but they did not challenge the underlying system of exploitation, merely redirecting its benefits to themselves rather than to the Spanish crown. The enslaved Africans who were part of the Caribbean world occupied an uncertain position in buccaneer society. Some buccaneers owned slaves, using them as servants or workers in the same way that respectable colonists did elsewhere. Some ships included enslaved men among their crews, their labour contributing to the enterprise even as they remained the property of others. And some formerly enslaved people became buccaneers themselves, escaping from Spanish or French or English ownership and finding in piracy a freedom that legitimate society denied them. The buccaneer articles that governed ship life sometimes specified that enslaved people captured in prizes would be divided as property, their bodies counted alongside gold and silver in the accounting of plunder. The contradiction between the freedom that buccaneers claimed for themselves and the bondage they imposed on others was not remarked upon in the 17th century. It was simply how the world worked, and the buccaneers were no more troubled by it than anyone else. The diseases that plagued the Caribbean were constant threats to the buccaneer population, tropical illnesses that killed more men than Spanish bullets ever did. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and a host of other diseases swept through crews and communities, their causes unknown and their treatments largely ineffective. The buccaneers attributed disease to bad air, to dietary imbalances, to divine punishment, to anything except the mosquitoes and contaminated water that were the actual sources of transmission. They treated disease with rum and prayer, and whatever folk remedies they had inherited or invented, occasionally succeeding by accident, but more often watching helplessly as their comrades died. The high mortality from disease was one reason why the buccaneers recruited constantly, always needing new men to replace those who had died of fever even before they could be killed in combat. The medical care available on Tortuga was primitive by modern standards, but not notably worse than what was available elsewhere in the 17th century. Surgeons accompanied many buccaneer voyages, men who could amputate damaged limbs and extract bullets, and perform the other bloody procedures that combat required. The surgeons' tools were crude, their knowledge limited, and their patients often died despite their best efforts, but they represented the medical technology of their era and were valued accordingly. The compensation that the buccaneer articles provided for lost limbs reflected both the frequency of such injuries and the importance of surgeons who could perform the amputations that saved lives at the cost of permanent disability. A man who lost a leg could receive his compensation only if he survived the surgery that removed it, and survival was never guaranteed. The decline of Tortuga as the centre of Caribbean piracy began in the 1680s, driven by changes in European politics, and by the success of the buccaneers themselves in provoking responses that they could not resist. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 marked a shift in English policy, a formal peace with Spain that made continued attacks on Spanish shipping officially unacceptable. The English governors of Jamaica, who had profited from the buccaneer trade, now found themselves under orders to suppress it, their commissions revoked, and their profitable arrangements with pirate captains terminated. Henry Morgan, the greatest of the buccaneers, was transformed from pirate admiral to pirate hunter, his new role as lieutenant governor requiring him to arrest the men who had once served under his command. The change was not immediate or complete, but it marked the beginning of the end for the buccaneer era. The French policy toward Tortuga shifted similarly, the needs of European diplomacy overriding the profits of Caribbean piracy. France was engaged in complex negotiations with Spain, and the activities of buccaneers operating from French territory were an obstacle to diplomatic progress. The governors of Tortuga were instructed to restrain the buccaneers, to limit their attacks to officially sanctioned targets, to bring the wild men of the island under some semblance of control. Some governors attempted to comply, prosecuting buccaneers who violated the new restrictions and trying to redirect the island's economy toward plantation agriculture. Others ignored their instructions, continuing to profit from piracy while sending reassuring reports to Paris. The policy shifts created uncertainty that made the buccaneer trade less attractive, the rules changing unpredictably, and the protection that commissions had provided becoming unreliable. The buccaneers who refused to accept the new restrictions found themselves squeezed between governments that had once supported them. Some retired from the trade, taking whatever wealth they had accumulated and settling into respectable obscurity. Some moved to new bases beyond the reach of the authorities, seeking out islands and coastlines where they could continue to operate without interference. Some became pirates in the full sense, attacking ships of all nations without the legal cover that privateering commissions had provided. The distinction between privateer and pirate had always been thin, but now it became the difference between tolerated useful criminal and hunted outlaw. Those who crossed the line found that the powers that had once protected them now sought their destruction. The physical decline of Tortuga accompanied its political marginalization, the island becoming less important as the buccaneer trade shifted elsewhere. The harbours that had sheltered pirate fleets fell into disuse, the warehouses emptied, the taverns closed or served a diminished clientele. The population declined as men left for other opportunities, the women and families that had begun to stabilise the community departing for more promising locations. The fortifications that had protected the island decayed, no longer maintained by governments that saw no strategic value in the place. Tortuga did not die completely. People continued to live there, fishing and farming and carrying on the ordinary activities of Caribbean life. But the glory days were over. The pirate capital reduced to a backwater that featured in stories but no longer mattered in reality. Port Royal in Jamaica briefly inherited Tortuga's role as the centre of Caribbean piracy, the English port offering the services and the tolerance that buccaneers required. Port Royal was larger and wealthier than Tortuga had ever been, a proper city with thousands of residents and all the amenities that civilization could provide. The buccaneers found there everything they had enjoyed on Tortuga, plus the additional attractions that a major port could offer. The taverns were more numerous, the prostitutes more available, the merchants more sophisticated in their ability to convert stolen goods into cash. Port Royal became known as the wickedest city in the world, a reputation that its residents cultivated and that attracted men seeking the pleasures that the wicked city could provide. The earthquake that destroyed Port Royal in 1692 seemed like divine judgment to many who witnessed it. The wicked city swallowed by the sea in a catastrophe that killed thousands and erased the physical infrastructure of Caribbean piracy. The earthquake struck on June 7th, liquefying the sandy soil on which the city was built and causing whole neighbourhoods to slide into the harbour. The shock was followed by a tsunami that swept over the ruins, drowning survivors and carrying debris out to sea. The death toll was staggering, perhaps 2,000 killed immediately, and many more dying afterward from injuries and disease. The survivors saw in the disaster the hand of God, punishment for the sins that had made Port Royal notorious, a warning that would be remembered for generations. The golden age of piracy that followed the buccaneer era produced new legends and new bases of operation, but it never replicated the unique community that Tortuga had represented. The pirates of the early 18th century, men like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts and Charles Vane, operated differently than the buccaneers had, their activities more individualistic and their bases more temporary. Nassau in the Bahamas became a pirate haven for a few years, but it was suppressed quickly when the British government decided to restore order. The pirate republic that Nassau briefly represented echoed the democracy of Tortuga, but it lacked the decades of development that had made the Buccaneer Island a true community. The Golden Age pirates were famous individually, but they never built anything like the collective enterprise that the Tortuga buccaneers had created. The memory of Tortuga survived the decline of the place itself, the stories of the pirate island becoming part of the folklore of the Caribbean and eventually of the world. The histories written in the 17th and 18th centuries preserved accounts of buccaneer exploits, exaggerating some details and inventing others, but capturing something of the spirit that had animated the community. Alexander Ekemlen's account of the buccaneers, published in Dutch in 1678 and quickly translated into other languages, became the standard source for stories of Tortuga and its inhabitants. Ekemlen had been a buccaneer himself, or at least had sailed with them, and his account combined first-hand knowledge with the embellishments that good storytelling required. The book shaped how Europeans understood Caribbean piracy, establishing images and narratives that would influence depictions of pirates for centuries to come. The romantic image of pirates that developed in later centuries drew heavily on the buccaneer tradition, transforming the brutal reality of Tortuga into an adventure suitable for popular entertainment. The pirates of fiction were brave and free, challenging the oppressive order of kings and merchants, living by their own code and answering to no one. The reality had been considerably grimmer, the violence more pervasive, and the exploitation more systematic than the romantic image acknowledged. But the romance served purposes that reality could not, providing an escape from the constraints of modern life and a fantasy of freedom that civilization seemed to deny. The pirates of Tortuga became symbols of rebellion and autonomy, their historical crimes forgiven in favour of the ideals they were imagined to represent. The treasure that the buccaneers captured has been sought ever since, the gold and silver of the Spanish Main exercising a fascination that 3 centuries have not diminished. Some of this treasure was spent as soon as it was captured, consumed in the taverns and brothels of Tortuga and Port Royal, converted to pleasures that left nothing behind. Some was invested in property or legitimate business, laundered into respectability by men who wanted to leave the pirate life behind. Some was lost in shipwrecks, scattered across the Caribbean floor when storms or battles sent ships and their cargoes to the bottom, and some perhaps was buried, hidden by men who hoped to return for it, but who died before they could, their secrets dying with them. The buried treasure of pirate legend is mostly fantasy, but the sheer volume of wealth that passed through buccaneer hands makes it possible that some remains undiscovered, waiting in some Caribbean hiding place for a finder who will never come. The shipwrecks that contain buccaneer treasure have been the focus of modern salvage efforts, underwater archaeologists and treasure hunters seeking the remains of vessels that went down with their cargoes intact. The technology for finding and excavating underwater sites has improved dramatically in recent decades, making accessible wrecks that earlier generations could not reach. Some significant discoveries have been made, ships identified and artifacts recovered that illuminate the buccaneer era in ways that documents alone cannot. But the hoped-for mother lode, the wreck filled with Spanish treasure captured by pirates and never recovered, has remained elusive. The Caribbean is large, its waters deep, and the ships that sank there are many. Finding a specific wreck among thousands requires luck as much as skill, and the luck has been limited. The archaeological sites on Tortuga itself have received less attention than the underwater wrecks, the land-based remains of the buccaneer community largely unexplored. The fortifications that protected the harbour survive in ruins, their walls providing evidence of the defensive works that the buccaneers constructed. The locations of the old town, the warehouses and taverns that served the buccaneer trade, can be identified from historical sources and from traces on the ground. But systematic excavation has not been conducted, the resources and interest necessary for such work directed elsewhere. The potential for discovery remains, the material culture of Tortuga waiting beneath the soil for archaeologists who may someday investigate what the pirates left behind. The modern island of Tortuga belongs to Haiti, the western nation that occupies the same Hispaniola that the buccaneers once used as a hunting ground. The island is known as Île de la Tortue in French, its official name reflecting the colonial heritage that it shares with the rest of Haiti. The population today is small, a few thousand people living in fishing villages and small farms, their lives shaped more by the poverty of Haiti than by the glamorous past of piracy. The tourists who visit seeking the Tortuga of legend find little to satisfy their expectations, the pirate capital reduced to ruins and memories that the current residents cannot monetize. The island that once attracted the most desperate and ambitious men in the Caribbean now struggles to attract anyone at all. The poverty of modern Haiti has prevented the development of Tortuga's historical sites, the resources necessary for preservation and interpretation simply unavailable. The ruins of the old fortifications deteriorate further each year, stones falling and vegetation encroaching, the physical remains of the buccaneer era disappearing gradually into the tropical landscape. The local population has more urgent concerns than heritage preservation, the immediate needs of survival taking precedence over the maintenance of historical memory. The tourists who might fund preservation rarely come, deterred by Haiti's reputation for instability and by the lack of infrastructure that would make visits comfortable. The past that made Tortuga famous provides no benefit to the present that its residents endure. The contrast between Tortuga's glorious past and its impoverished present is stark. The pirate kingdom that once rivaled European powers, now one of the poorest places in the Western Hemisphere. The wealth that flowed through Tortuga in the 17th century left no lasting legacy, consumed in pleasures that provided no foundation for future prosperity. The buccaneers built nothing permanent, invested nothing in the long-term development of the island they called home, and when they departed or died, they took whatever they had accumulated with them. The pattern was characteristic of extractive enterprises throughout the colonial period, wealth removed from the Caribbean rather than invested in it, leaving poverty behind when the extraction ended. The environmental condition of Tortuga reflects the broader environmental crisis affecting Haiti, deforestation and erosion stripping the island of the resources that once made it valuable. The forests that provided timber for ships and cover for hunters have been cut down, the wood consumed for fuel and construction, leaving barren hillsides that erode with every rain. The soil that once supported agriculture washes into the sea, the fertility that might sustain the population disappearing along with the trees that held it in place. The environmental degradation feeds the poverty, which in turn drives further degradation, a cycle that has been repeated throughout Haiti and that shows no sign of ending. The waters around Tortuga remain as they were in the buccaneer era, blue and warm and teeming with fish that local fishermen harvest, using methods that have changed little over centuries. The coral reefs that fringe the island provide habitat for the marine life that once fed the buccaneers and that now feeds their distant descendants. The currents that carried pirate ships to their hunting grounds still flow, the same patterns of wind and water that shaped 17th century navigation. The natural environment has proven more resilient than the human environment, the sea maintaining its character even as the island has been transformed by centuries of exploitation. The harbour where buccaneer ships once anchored is still visible, the natural bay that provided shelter and that made Tortuga strategically valuable. Small fishing boats occupy the anchorage now, their modest forms a far cry from the pirate vessels that once filled the harbour. The approaches that Spanish expeditions navigated when they attacked the island can still be traced. The channels and headlands that featured in historical accounts identifiable on the ground. A visitor with historical knowledge can reconstruct the geography of the buccaneer era, can see where the fortification stood and where the town was located, can imagine the ships at anchor and the men moving through streets that no longer exist. The imagination provides what reality cannot, the pirate island conjured from fragments that time has not entirely erased. The legends of Tortuga have spread far beyond the Caribbean, the pirate island becoming a global symbol of freedom and adventure that transcends its specific history. The name Tortuga appears in films and novels and video games, invoked whenever a story requires a pirate haven where the rules of civilization do not apply. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the most commercially successful pirate entertainment in history, features Tortuga prominently, depicting a version of the island that is entirely fictional, but that captures something of the spirit the place represents. The fictional Tortuga is wilder and more colourful than the historical one, its taverns and streets populated by characters who exist only in imagination. But the fiction draws on the history, transforming historical fragments into entertainment that reaches audiences who will never visit the actual island or read the historical sources. The cultural impact of the Tortuga legend extends beyond entertainment into politics and philosophy, the Pirate Republic serving as a reference point for discussions of alternative social organisation. Anarchist and libertarian thinkers have invoked the buccaneers as examples of voluntary association, communities that governed themselves without the coercion of the state. The democratic practices of the pirate ships, the election of captains and the division of plunder by agreement seem to anticipate modern ideals of self-governance that emerged centuries later. The reality was more complicated than these interpretations acknowledge, the freedom of the buccaneers depending on the exploitation of others and their democracy extending only to those within the community. But the romantic image of pirate freedom has proven durable, serving purposes that historical accuracy cannot address. The economics of piracy have attracted scholarly attention in recent years, academics analysing the buccaneer enterprise as a business that operated according to rational principles. The articles that governed pirate ships can be read as contracts, agreements that specified the rights and obligations of participants and that provided mechanisms for dispute resolution. The compensation for injuries can be understood as insurance, a system for distributing risk that anticipated modern insurance markets by centuries. The election of captains can be analysed as a governance mechanism, a way of ensuring that leadership served the interests of the governed rather than just the ambitions of the leader. These economic analyses strip the romance from piracy, but add intellectual interest, revealing the rationality that underlay what seemed like chaos. The violence of piracy has also attracted scholarly attention, researchers examining the strategic use of terror by buccaneer captains. The cruelty that L'Olonnais and others displayed was not merely sadism but strategy, deliberate displays of violence designed to encourage future victims to surrender without resistance. The reputation for cruelty was a weapon that reduced the need for actual cruelty. Victims surrendering to avoid treatment that they had heard described in terrifying detail. The torture of prisoners could be understood as information extraction, the pain inflicted serving the practical purpose of locating hidden valuables. These interpretations do not excuse the violence but explain it, placing buccaneer cruelty within a framework of rational calculation rather than pure malevolence. The gender dynamics of buccaneer society have interested historians seeking to understand women's experiences in the age of piracy. The women of Tortuga occupied a narrow range of roles, their options limited by the male dominance of the community and by the economics that made their bodies commodities. Some women exercised agency within these constraints, building lives that provided security if not equality. A few women became pirates themselves, most famously Anne Bonny and Mary Red, who sailed with Calico Jack Rackham in the early 18th century, and who demonstrated that women could perform the same roles as men in the pirate trade. But these exceptions proved the rule. Piracy was an overwhelmingly male enterprise, and women's participation was marginal at best. The racial composition of buccaneer crews was more diverse than the European societies from which most pirates came, the outlaw community accepting men of different races in ways that legitimate institutions did not. Men of African descent, both free and enslaved, served aboard pirate ships, their presence recorded in documents that describe crews of mixed heritage. Some formerly enslaved people escaped bondage by joining pirate crews, finding in piracy a freedom that was denied them elsewhere. The racial equality of pirate ships was real but limited, the acceptance of black crew members coexisting with the participation of pirates in the slave trade. The buccaneers did not challenge the system of racial exploitation that characterized the Atlantic world. They simply operated within it in ways that sometimes benefited individuals who would otherwise have been victims. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean had been largely destroyed by the time the buccaneers arrived, victims of disease and violence that accompanied European colonization. The Taino and other peoples who had inhabited the islands for centuries were reduced to remnants by the mid-17th century, their populations decimated and their cultures disrupted beyond recovery. The buccaneers encountered the survivors of this catastrophe and learned from them techniques of hunting and food preparation that the indigenous peoples had developed over millennia. The boucan that gave the buccaneers their name was indigenous technology, adopted by Europeans who found it useful for their purposes. The cultural inheritance from indigenous peoples was one of the few things the buccaneers did not steal. It was given, or rather it survived the destruction of the peoples who had created it. The Spanish perspective on the buccaneers was, understandably, quite different from the romantic image that later generations would construct. To the Spanish, the buccaneers were simply criminals, thieves, and murderers who attacked innocent merchants and violated the peace that international law was supposed to guarantee. The Spanish residents of Caribbean ports lived in constant fear of buccaneer attack, knowing that their lives and property might be taken at any moment by men who had no respect for law or humanity. The survivors of buccaneer raids testified to atrocities that the romantic legend prefers to forget: the torture and murder of prisoners, the rape of women, the destruction of communities that would never recover. The Spanish perspective deserves acknowledgement, a corrective to the heroic narratives that the buccaneers' cultural descendants have preferred to tell. The defensive measures that the Spanish developed in response to the buccaneer threat shaped the architecture and administration of the colonial Caribbean. The fortifications that still stand in Cartagena and San Juan and other Spanish ports were built to resist pirate attack, massive walls and bastions that transformed cities into citadels. The convoy system that grouped ships together for mutual protection was refined in response to buccaneer tactics, the treasure fleets sailing on schedules designed to minimize vulnerability. The Coast Guard vessels that patrolled Caribbean waters were deployed specifically to intercept pirates, their presence a constant reminder of the danger that the sea lanes faced. The Spanish invested enormous resources in protecting their colonial enterprise from the buccaneers, resources that might have been used for other purposes had the pirate threat not existed. The economic impact of buccaneer activity on the Spanish colonial economy was significant but difficult to quantify precisely. The direct losses from captured ships and plundered cities were substantial, millions of pieces of eight diverted from the Spanish treasury to buccaneer pockets. The indirect costs were probably larger, including the expense of defensive measures, the increased insurance rates for Caribbean voyages, the disruption of trade patterns that piracy caused, and the psychological impact on merchants and sailors who knew that every voyage might end in capture. The Spanish economy was vast enough to absorb these losses, but they contributed to the gradual decline that would transform Spain from the dominant European power to a second-tier nation over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. The international law that the Spanish invoked against the buccaneers was still in its infancy, the principles that would govern relations between nations not yet fully developed. The Spanish claimed that attacking their ships in peacetime was illegal, that the letters of marque issued by English and French governors were invalid, that the buccaneers were criminals who deserved execution rather than recognition. The English and French responded that war existed between their nations and Spain, that the commissions were therefore valid, and that the buccaneers were privateers rather than pirates. The legal arguments were complicated by the practical reality that governments found the buccaneers useful and were unwilling to suppress them. The law was whatever power decided it would be, and power in the Caribbean was divided among nations whose interests conflicted. The moral arguments about piracy were equally contested, defenders of the buccaneers pointing to Spanish cruelty as justification for buccaneer violence. The Spanish colonial enterprise had been built on conquest and exploitation, the destruction of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Africans, crimes that exceeded anything the buccaneers committed. The wealth that the buccaneers stole had been stolen first by Spain, extracted from mines worked by enslaved labourers under conditions that killed millions. If the buccaneers were criminals, they were criminals who preyed on criminals, their victims not innocent merchants, but participants in a system of exploitation that dwarfed anything the pirates could organise. The moral calculus was complex, the easy distinctions between good and evil breaking down when examined closely. The religious dimensions of the conflict added another layer of justification for both sides. Spain was a Catholic power, its empire an extension of the Catholic faith that had a duty to spread Christianity and suppress heresy. The buccaneers were predominantly Protestant, or at least they came from nations that had rejected Catholic authority, and their attacks on Spain could be framed as religious warfare. The conflict between Catholic and Protestant had convulsed Europe for over a century, and the Caribbean extension of that conflict seemed natural to participants on both sides. The religious framing made compromise more difficult, each side seeing the other as enemies of God whose destruction was a sacred duty. The wars of religion gave moral cover to what was essentially economic competition, the treasure of the Americas being the real stake regardless of what the propagandists claimed. The legacy of the buccaneers extends into the present in ways that are often unrecognized, their influence woven into the fabric of Caribbean society and culture. The patterns of authority and resistance that characterized buccaneer communities have echoes in the political culture of the region, the suspicion of distant authority and the preference for local control that shape Caribbean attitudes toward governance. The maritime traditions that the buccaneers practiced, the skills and knowledge that made them successful, were transmitted to subsequent generations and remain part of Caribbean seafaring culture. The stories that the buccaneers left behind, the legends of treasure and adventure, are part of the cultural heritage that Caribbean nations share and that attracts visitors whose spending supports local economies. The tourism industry that has developed throughout the Caribbean trades heavily on the pirate image, destinations competing to offer the most authentic pirate experience to visitors seeking adventure and romance. The cruise ships that carry millions of passengers through Caribbean waters stop at ports that promise pirate-themed entertainment, the buccaneers reduced to mascots for an industry they could never have imagined. The gift shops sell pirate hats and eye patches and plastic swords, merchandise that bears no resemblance to anything actual buccaneers would have used, but that satisfies tourist expectations shaped by movies and television. The commercialization of piracy is complete, the dangerous reality transformed into harmless entertainment that offends no one and enriches everyone involved except, perhaps, the historical memory of what piracy actually meant. The films that have shaped modern understanding of piracy draw on the buccaneer tradition even when they do not depict it directly. The swashbuckler genre that flourished in Hollywood's golden age presented pirates as romantic heroes, handsome men fighting for freedom and justice in a world of tyranny and corruption. Errol Flynn and Douglas Fairbanks and Tyrone Power brought the pirate to life on screen, their performances defining an archetype that audiences would expect for generations afterward. The more recent Pirates of the Caribbean franchise has updated the image, adding supernatural elements and ironic humor, but maintaining the essential romantic core. The pirates of these films are descendants of the Tortuga buccaneers, their fictional adventures built on the foundation of historical fact that the 17th century provided. The literature that has explored piracy ranges from sensational adventure stories to serious historical novels, each genre offering its own interpretation of what the buccaneer life meant. Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson's classic, created images and characters that have become inextricable from the pirate myth. Long John Silver's Parrot and the Buried Treasure, and the Black Spot all entering the cultural vocabulary. The novel was not set in Tortuga or the buccaneer era, but it drew on the traditions that the buccaneers had established, the conventions of pirate storytelling that earlier generations had developed. Every pirate story since has been influenced by Stevenson, his vision of piracy shaping expectations that later writers must either satisfy or subvert. The academic study of piracy has grown substantially in recent decades, historians examining the buccaneers with rigour that earlier generations had not applied. The archives that contain documents from the buccaneer era have been mined for information, court records and colonial correspondence and ships' logs, revealing details that previous researchers had missed. The material culture of piracy has been investigated through underwater archaeology, shipwrecks yielding artefacts that illuminate daily life aboard pirate vessels. The social history of the Caribbean has been reconstructed to place the buccaneers in their proper context, the pirate community understood as one element in a larger system of colonial exploitation and resistance. The scholarly work has complicated the romantic image without entirely dispelling it, the historical buccaneers proving as interesting as their fictional counterparts, if in different ways. The questions that the buccaneer experience raises remain relevant to modern societies. The issues of governance and justice and freedom that the pirates confronted still debated today. How should communities organize themselves? What rights do individuals have against collective authority? When is violence justified, and against whom? What obligations do the privileged have to the less fortunate? The buccaneers answered these questions in their own way, creating a society that was brutal and democratic, exploitative and egalitarian, depending on which aspect you examined. Their answers were not our answers, but their questions persist, asked anew by each generation that confronts the problems of living together in a world of scarcity and conflict. The Caribbean Sea that the buccaneers sailed has changed little since the 17th century, the waters following the same currents and the winds blowing in the same patterns that guided pirate ships to their destinations. The geography of the region remains as it was, the islands scattered across the sea in the same positions they have occupied for millions of years. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, painting the sky in colours that the buccaneers would have recognised. The tropical sunsets are spectacular now, as they were 4 centuries ago. The physical environment connects the present to the past in ways that human environments cannot, the natural world persisting while human constructions rise and fall and are forgotten. The storms that sweep through the Caribbean each hurricane season continue to reshape the landscape as they have always done, the same destructive force that the buccaneers feared and respected. The hurricanes that scattered fleets and levelled settlements were facts of life in the 17th century, dangers that could not be avoided and that had to be accepted as part of the cost of doing business in tropical waters. Modern technology can predict hurricanes and warn of their approach, but it cannot stop them or reduce their power. The residents of the Caribbean today live with the same threat that the buccaneers faced, the annual possibility of catastrophic destruction that cannot be prevented, only prepared for. The coral reefs that surround the Caribbean islands were navigation hazards for buccaneer ships, hidden dangers that could tear the bottom out of a vessel and send it to the bottom with all hands. The same reefs now attract tourists who come to snorkel and dive, the underwater scenery that once threatened ships now serving as an attraction for visitors from cold climates. The reefs are under threat from warming oceans and acidification, the environmental changes that human activity has caused affecting marine ecosystems throughout the world. The buccaneers damaged many things, but they did not damage the reefs. That destruction has been reserved for later generations whose technology gives them power that the buccaneers could not imagine. The fish that swim in Caribbean waters are descendants of the fish that fed buccaneer crews, the same species that have inhabited these waters since before humans existed. The fishing techniques that Caribbean peoples have developed over centuries continue to be practiced, boats going out in the morning and returning with catches that local markets can sell. The abundance that once seemed inexhaustible has been diminished by overfishing and habitat destruction. The marine resources that supported human populations for millennia, now strained by demands that exceed what the ecosystem can sustain. The buccaneers took what they needed without thought for the future, but the scale of their taking was small enough that the sea could recover. The scale of modern taking is different, and recovery is not guaranteed. The night sky over the Caribbean is darker than it was over the European cities from which most buccaneers came. The absence of artificial light allowing stars to shine with an intensity that modern city dwellers rarely see. The buccaneers navigated by these stars using their positions to determine latitude and to guide ships across trackless waters. The same stars are visible today to anyone who looks up from the deck of a ship or the beach of an island. The constellations in the same positions they occupied 400 years ago. The stars connected the buccaneers to navigators stretching back to antiquity, the same celestial guides that had directed Phoenician traders and Polynesian voyagers, showing the way for Caribbean pirates. The technology of navigation has changed, but the stars remain, indifferent to the purposes of those who use them. The darkness of a Caribbean night, with no moon and no clouds, is profound, the kind of darkness that modern people rarely experience. The buccaneers knew this darkness intimately, the hours between sunset and sunrise when ships could move unseen and attacks could be prepared without warning. The darkness was both protection and danger, concealing pirates from their victims but also concealing hazards that could wreck ships and end voyages. The buccaneers developed night vision through constant practice, their eyes adapting to low light in ways that modern eyes, accustomed to constant illumination, have forgotten. The darkness was part of their world in a way that it is no longer part of ours. The conquest of night by electric light, one of the changes that separates the buccaneer era from the present. The dawn that ended each night was a daily renewal, the sun rising over the eastern horizon and revealing a world that had been hidden in darkness. The buccaneers preferred to attack at dawn, their ships approaching during the night and striking when the first light allowed them to see their targets. The dramatic timing was practical rather than theatrical, the dawn assault maximizing surprise while providing enough light for effective combat. The pattern was so consistent that merchant captains learned to fear the sunrise, the beautiful beginning of each day carrying the possibility of violent interruption. The dawn over the Caribbean today is as beautiful as it ever was, the sky lightening through shades of pink and gold, the sea reflecting colours that no artist can quite capture. The danger that the dawn once carried has passed, but the beauty remains. The waves that lap against the shores of Tortuga today are the same waves, in a sense, that lapped against the shores when buccaneers walked the beaches, the eternal motion of water against land that continues regardless of who occupies the island. The sound of the waves would have been familiar to any buccaneer, the rhythm of the sea that was the constant backdrop to their lives. The buccaneers spent more time at sea than on land, the motion of the waves beneath their feet more familiar than the stability of solid ground. The waves carried their ships to prizes and profits, carried them home with plunder, carried some of them to watery graves when storms or battles ended their voyages. The sea was their life, and for many it was their death, the same element that sustained them eventually claiming them. The tides that rise and fall along the Caribbean coasts follow patterns that the buccaneers understood through practical experience, rather than scientific explanation. The tides of the Caribbean are relatively modest compared to other oceanic regions, the enclosed nature of the sea limiting the tidal range. But even modest tides affect navigation, revealing and concealing hazards, providing and denying access to harbours, determining when ships can safely approach or depart. The buccaneers who operated in these waters learned the tidal patterns intimately, knowledge passed from experienced sailors to novices as part of the education that piracy required. The same tides flow today, following the same lunar cycles that have governed them for billions of years. The currents that flow through the Caribbean were highways for the buccaneers, natural paths that carried ships in predictable directions and that shaped the routes of commerce and predation. The Gulf Stream that flows northward along the coast of Florida was the return route for Spanish treasure fleets, ships riding the current to speed their journey back to Europe. The buccaneers knew these currents and positioned themselves to intercept ships following them. Their knowledge of oceanography turned to criminal purposes. The currents continue to flow, now mapped with precision that the buccaneers never possessed, their patterns understood through science that has revealed what experience once had to teach. The wind that filled buccaneer sails was the essential resource that made maritime piracy possible, the force that propelled ships across distances that no other technology could span. The trade winds that blow steadily across the Caribbean were the highways of the age of sail, reliable flows of air that ships could count on and that navigators could plan around. The buccaneers understood the wind patterns of the Caribbean as thoroughly as they understood the currents, the combination of wind and water determining where they could go and how quickly they could get there. The wind was a gift when it blew favourable and a curse when it did not, the source of their mobility and also the limit on their options. The calm that could descend on the Caribbean without warning was every sailor's fear, the wind dying and leaving ships motionless on a glassy sea. The buccaneers could do nothing when the wind failed. Their ships becalmed while supplies dwindled and men grew restless. The calms could last for days, the sun beating down on decks where shade was scarce and water was rationed. Oars could move a ship in calm conditions, but the labour was exhausting and the progress slow, inadequate for covering the distances that Caribbean sailing required. The buccaneers waited out the calms as sailors had always waited, hoping for the wind to return and knowing that hope was all they had. The rain that falls on the Caribbean islands was a resource that the buccaneers collected and stored, fresh water being essential for survival, and scarce enough to require careful management. The ships carried water in casks that were heavy and that took up space that might otherwise hold cargo, the logistics of water supply constraining how long voyages could last. The rain that fell during voyages could supplement the stored water, awnings and sails catching the precipitation and directing it into containers. The tropical rainstorms that drenched the Caribbean regularly were welcome when they came. The fresh water falling from the sky, a gift that nature provided and that sailors gratefully received. The heat of the tropical climate was a constant presence that shaped how the buccaneers lived and worked. The Caribbean is warm throughout the year, the temperatures rarely falling below levels that Europeans would consider comfortable, and frequently rising to levels that made physical exertion dangerous. The buccaneers adapted to the heat as they adapted to everything else, adjusting their routines to avoid the worst of the midday sun, seeking shade when they could, and accepting discomfort when they could not. The heat contributed to the disease burden that made the Caribbean so deadly. The warm, moist conditions ideal for the mosquitoes that spread yellow fever and malaria. The heat was part of the environment that the buccaneers inhabited, inescapable and uncontrollable, simply the nature of the world where they had chosen to make their living. The creatures of the Caribbean that the buccaneers encountered ranged from the useful to the dangerous to the merely strange, the tropical environment hosting species that European sailors had never imagined. The sea turtles that gave Tortuga its name were harvested for food, their meat a welcome change from the salt provisions that dominated shipboard diet. The manatees that inhabited Caribbean waters were hunted as well, their flesh reportedly tasting like beef, and their size providing substantial nourishment for hungry crews. The dolphins that accompanied ships were observed with affection, their playful presence a diversion during long voyages, though they were occasionally killed for food when other provisions ran low. The sharks that patrolled Caribbean waters were a constant presence, and an occasional threat, the predators drawn to ships by the garbage and waste that vessels produced. The buccaneers knew that falling overboard might mean death by shark as well as death by drowning. The waters they sailed hosting species whose appetite for flesh was legendary. The sharks followed slave ships, feeding on the bodies thrown overboard, a grim connection between the marine predators and the human predation that characterized the Atlantic economy. The buccaneers were predators too, and they recognized kinship with the sharks even as they feared them. The birds of the Caribbean were numerous and varied, their presence often signalling land when no land was visible. The pelicans that dove for fish, the frigate birds that soared on thermals, the parrots that screamed in the forest canopy, all were part of the environment that the buccaneers inhabited. Some birds were captured and kept as pets, parrots in particular being prized for their ability to mimic human speech, and for the colour they brought to ships' quarters. The famous association between pirates and parrots has some historical basis, the birds being common enough in the Caribbean that sailors who wanted them could easily obtain them. The insects of the Caribbean were a constant torment. mosquitoes and flies and biting gnats making life miserable for anyone who spent time in the tropical environment. The diseases that insects transmitted were deadly, their role in spreading yellow fever and malaria not yet understood, but their presence universally despised. The buccaneers had no effective protection against insects, no screens or repellents, or even accurate understanding of what made the creatures dangerous. They simply endured, accepting the bites and the discomfort as part of the price of living in the Caribbean, dying of insect-borne diseases at rates that would be unacceptable today. The plants of the Caribbean provided food, medicine, and materials that the buccaneers used for survival. The tropical fruits that grew wild or in cultivation were welcome additions to a diet dominated by preserved foods, their vitamins helping to prevent the scurvy that plagued sailors on long voyages. The tobacco that grew throughout the region was consumed in quantities that would horrify modern health advocates, the buccaneers smoking pipes or chewing leaves as they worked and relaxed. The sugar that made the Caribbean economically valuable was converted to rum, the distilled spirit that was the buccaneers' drink of choice and that lubricated the social life of every pirate haven. The timber of the Caribbean forests was essential for maintaining the ships on which buccaneer livelihood depended. The wooden vessels required constant repair, their hulls attacked by treader worms that bored through planking, their rigging frayed by wind and salt, their masts and spars damaged by storms and combat. The forests of Hispaniola and Tortuga provided the wood necessary for repairs, the buccaneers careening their ships on remote beaches and replacing damaged components with fresh-cut timber. The skill of the ship's carpenter was valued accordingly, the craftsman who could keep a vessel seaworthy being essential to every crew that hoped to stay afloat. The gold that the buccaneers sought was the ultimate object of their labour, the metal that Spain had extracted from the Americas in quantities that transformed European economies. The gold came from mines in Colombia and other locations, the indigenous peoples who had worked the surface deposits replaced by enslaved labourers who dug deeper and died faster. The gold was concentrated in the ports of the Spanish Main, shipped in convoys that the buccaneers could rarely attack directly, but that fed smaller ships and local commerce that were more vulnerable. The gold, when captured, was divided according to the articles, each man's share determined by his rank and role, the precious metal converted to the pleasures that Tortuga and other ports could provide. The gold was why they risked everything, the ultimate prize that justified the danger and the hardship and the violence of their trade. The silver that flowed from the Spanish-American mines in even greater quantities than the gold was the other great prize that the buccaneers sought. The silver mountain of Potosi in Peru was the single richest source of precious metal in the world, its output so vast that it altered the economies of nations on both sides of the Atlantic. The silver was shipped from Peru to Panama, carried across the isthmus by mule train, and loaded onto ships for the voyage to Spain. The route was vulnerable at multiple points, and the buccaneers exploited each vulnerability, attacking mule trains and coastal shipping, and occasionally the ports where the silver was collected. The silver when captured was heavy, its bulk making it harder to transport than gold, but its value made the effort worthwhile. The emeralds and other gems that came from the mines of Colombia were smaller and more valuable per unit of weight than silver, prizes that a buccaneer could conceal in his clothing and convert to wealth in any port that had buyers. The gem trade was controlled by Spanish merchants who shipped the stones to Europe through official channels, but some gems leaked into unofficial circulation, captured by pirates or purchased from corrupt officials who diverted them from their intended destinations. The buccaneers who captured gems faced the challenge of selling them, the specialized knowledge required to evaluate stones making it easy for unscrupulous buyers to cheat ignorant sellers. The smart pirate found an honest broker, if such a person existed, or learned enough about gems to avoid being cheated too badly. The trade goods that circulated through the Caribbean were valuable even when they were not made of precious metal. The manufactured products of Europe exchanged for the raw materials of the Americas, cloth and tools and weapons, books and paper and glassware. The products of European workshops were shipped to the colonies and sold at prices that reflected the cost of transportation and the monopoly that Spain maintained on colonial trade. The buccaneers captured these goods along with the precious metals, selling them in markets that were happy to buy stolen merchandise at discounted prices. The trade goods were less glamorous than gold and silver, but they were more consistently available and more reliably profitable. The enslaved people who were transported across the Atlantic in the millions were the most valuable cargo that the buccaneers captured. Human beings whose labor could be sold to planters desperate for workers. The Spanish colonies were not the primary market for enslaved people, the bulk of the trade flowing to Brazil and the Caribbean sugar islands. But demand existed everywhere that plantation agriculture was practiced. The buccaneers who captured slave ships had several options. They could sell the captives in Spanish colonial ports, they could transport them to other markets, they could keep some as their own servants, or they could recruit the willing into their crews. The moral dimensions of this commerce were not considered by most buccaneers. Enslaved people were property, valuable property, and capturing them was simply good business. The ships themselves that the buccaneers captured were often as valuable as their cargoes, vessels that could be added to the fleet or sold to buyers who asked no questions about provenance. A well-built ship was a significant investment. Years of skilled labour embodied in timber and iron and rope, and capturing one intact was a substantial prize. The buccaneers sometimes kept captured ships, incorporating them into their operations and expanding their capabilities. Sometimes they sold them, the black market for stolen ships active in every Caribbean port. Sometimes they stripped valuable fittings and burned the hulls, the destruction denying the vessel to enemies while providing the satisfaction of destruction. The ransom that prisoners could yield was another source of buccaneer income, wealthy captives being held until their families or governments paid for their release. The ransom system required communication with the prisoners' connections, negotiations over the amount to be paid, and arrangements for the exchange that left both parties reasonably safe from betrayal. The process could take months, the prisoner held in conditions that varied from comfortable to brutal depending on the captor and the circumstances. The ransom was calculated based on what the prisoner could afford. Wealthy captives commanded higher prices, and those who could not pay were released, sold as slaves, or killed depending on the inclinations of their captors. The legacy of Tortuga in the broader history of democracy is debated by historians who see in the buccaneer communities precursors to later democratic movements. The election of captains, the division of plunder by agreement, the written articles that specified rights and obligations all seem to anticipate the democratic institutions that would emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries. The buccaneers created a system of self-governance that gave ordinary men voice and power, a radical departure from the hierarchical societies they had left behind in Europe. The democratic practices were limited, extending only to those within the community, and excluding the many who were exploited or enslaved, but they were real within their limits, and they demonstrated that alternatives to monarchy and aristocracy were possible. The influence of buccaneer democracy on later political thought is difficult to trace directly, the pirates not being figures that political philosophers cited as precedents. But the example existed, the knowledge that men had governed themselves successfully without kings or lords, and that knowledge may have shaped attitudes even when it was not explicitly acknowledged. The American and French revolutions that created modern democratic institutions drew on many sources, and some of those sources may have included awareness of the pirate communities that had practiced self-governance centuries before. The connection is speculative, but it is not impossible the buccaneer legacy flowing through channels that historians cannot always follow. The economic legacy of the buccaneers is clearer, their activities having contributed to the transfer of wealth from Spain to the nations that sponsored piracy. The gold and silver that the buccaneers captured was spent in markets throughout the Atlantic world, stimulating economies that benefited from the injection of precious metal. The English economy in particular gained from the buccaneer trade, the pirates who operated from Jamaica bringing Spanish treasure into circulation in ways that legitimate commerce could not replicate. The weakening of Spain that resulted from buccaneer predation contributed to the rise of other colonial powers, the decline of Spanish dominance creating opportunities that England and France exploited. The cultural legacy of the buccaneers is perhaps the most enduring, the image of the Caribbean pirate becoming a global symbol that transcends its historical origins. The pirate has become an archetype, a figure representing freedom and adventure that can be deployed in any context that requires those qualities. The buccaneer origins of this archetype are often forgotten. The specific history of Tortuga and the Spanish Main absorbed into a generic pirate image that applies equally to any era or location. But the origins matter, the particular history that produced the image providing depth and meaning that the archetype alone cannot contain. The treasure that the buccaneers captured and spent and lost remains an object of fascination. the fantasy of buried gold continuing to attract seekers who hope to find what time has hidden. The treasure is probably gone, converted to pleasures long ago, or scattered across the Caribbean in amounts too small to be worth seeking, but the possibility remains, the chance that somewhere in the islands a chest of Spanish gold awaits discovery, and the possibility is enough to sustain dreams. The treasure hunters who search the Caribbean are following in the footsteps of the buccaneers themselves, seeking fortune in waters that have always promised wealth to those willing to take risks. The islands that the buccaneers made famous continue to trade on their pirate heritage, the tourism industry that has developed throughout the Caribbean building on the romantic image that history has bequeathed. The cruise ships that carry passengers from island to island offer pirate-themed entertainment, the visitors dressing in costumes and drinking rum and pretending for a few hours to be outlaws themselves. The pretense is harmless, the reality of piracy safely in the past, the violence and exploitation that characterized buccaneer life sanitized into entertainment for comfortable tourists. The gap between the reality and the fantasy is vast, but the fantasy serves purposes that reality cannot, providing escape and adventure in forms that do not require the risks that actual piracy demanded. The night settles over the Caribbean as it has settled for countless nights before, the darkness covering the islands and the sea in a blanket that conceals whatever lies beneath. The stars emerge one by one, the same stars that guided buccaneer ships to their destinations, the same constellations that have watched over this sea since before humans existed to observe them. The waves continue their eternal motion, the sound of water against shore the same sound that buccaneers heard when they walked the beaches of Tortuga planning their next voyage. The pirates are gone, their kingdom dissolved into history and legend, their treasure scattered and lost. But the sea remains, and the islands remain, and the stories remain, told and retold to those who want to imagine what it might have been like to live in a world where a man could build his own kingdom and answer to no one but himself. The moon rises over Tortuga tonight as it rose over the Buccaneer Islands centuries ago, the same silver light illuminating shores that once hosted the most notorious outlaws of the Atlantic world. The moonlight falls on ruins that were once fortifications, on beaches that were once anchorages, on hills that were once watchtowers scanning the horizon for approaching sails. The island is quiet now, its population small and poor, its days of glory long past and unlikely to return. But the moonlight does not distinguish between glorious and ordinary, between famous and forgotten. It falls equally on all, revealing whatever lies beneath its gentle illumination. The silence of a Caribbean night is not quite silence, the sounds of nature filling the darkness with a symphony that the buccaneers would have known well. The tree frogs that sing from every bush create a wall of sound that seems impossibly loud to those unaccustomed to tropical nights. The insects add their voices to the chorus, the buzz and whine of creatures whose names the buccaneers never knew, but whose presence they could not escape. The occasional splash of something entering the water, the cry of a night bird, the rustle of wind through leaves, all combine to create an atmosphere that is alive even in the deepest darkness. The history of Tortuga is written in the fragments that remain, the ruins and documents and stories that preserve some portion of what once existed. The fragments are incomplete, the full picture impossible to reconstruct, the lives of individual buccaneers mostly lost to the indifference of time. We know the famous names, Morgan and Lolonais and a handful of others, but the thousands of men who served under them are anonymous, their experiences unrecorded, their deaths unmarked. The history we have is the history of the exceptional, the ordinary majority disappearing into a past that preserved only what it considered worth remembering. The future of Tortuga is uncertain, the island facing challenges that the buccaneers never imagined and could not have solved if they had. The poverty that grips Haiti affects Tortuga as thoroughly as it affects the mainland, the residents struggling to survive in an economy that offers few opportunities. The environmental degradation that is stripping the island of its resources continues unchecked. The deforestation and erosion that have transformed other parts of Haiti, already visible on Tortuga as well. The climate change that is affecting the entire Caribbean will bring challenges that no one can fully predict. Sea level rise and intensifying storms threatening communities that lack the resources to adapt. The memory of the buccaneers offers little practical guidance for addressing these challenges, the pirates having been takers rather than builders, extractors rather than sustainers. The wealth that flowed through Tortuga left no lasting legacy, no institutions or infrastructure that subsequent generations could build upon. The buccaneers took what they could and spent what they took, living for the present with no thought for any future beyond their own lifetimes. The pattern was characteristic of colonial exploitation throughout the Caribbean, wealth removed from the region rather than invested in it, leaving poverty behind when the extraction ended. The romance of piracy is seductive, the fantasy of freedom and adventure appealing to those whose lives feel constrained and ordinary. The buccaneers seem to offer an escape from the rules and obligations that govern modern existence, a world where a man could make his own destiny without asking permission from anyone. The romance is not entirely false. The buccaneers did enjoy freedoms that legitimate society denied, did create communities that governed themselves according to principles they chose. But the romance conceals as much as it reveals the violence and exploitation and suffering that were inseparable from the freedom that the buccaneers claimed. The islands sleep now, Tortuga and all the other islands of the Caribbean, the darkness covering them as it has covered them for billions of years. The pirates who once made these islands famous are gone, their bones scattered in unmarked graves or dissolved in the sea that was their home. The gold they sought and captured has been dispersed throughout the world, its origins in Spanish mines and buccaneer raids forgotten as it passed from hand to hand. The stories they left behind are all that remains, tales of adventure and cruelty, of freedom and exploitation, of a world that existed briefly and that we can now only imagine. The Caribbean keeps its secrets, the sea and the islands holding memories that they do not share, waiting for those who care enough to look and listen. The night is long, and the dreams it brings may carry you to places you have never been, to times you cannot visit, to a pirate island where the rules were different and the possibilities seemed endless. Rest now, and let the waves carry you where they will, to Tortuga or beyond, to whatever destination your dreams decide. Good night. The articles that governed buccaneer ships deserve closer examination, the documents that created order from what might otherwise have been chaos. These articles were contracts, agreed upon before each voyage and binding on all who signed them. The articles specified how plunder would be divided, what compensation would be paid for injuries, how disputes would be resolved, and what rules would govern conduct aboard ship. The specificity of these documents reflected the importance of clear expectations in a community where disagreement could quickly become violent. Every man knew what he was entitled to and what was expected of him. The articles providing a framework that allowed cooperation among men who might otherwise have been enemies. The division of plunder that the articles specified followed patterns that were remarkably consistent across different crews and different eras. The captain typically received 2 shares, reflecting his greater responsibility and the skills that earned him his position. The quartermaster, who managed the ship's daily operations and represented the crew in dealings with the captain, received 1.5 shares. Other officers received proportionally more than common sailors, but the differential was modest compared to the vast inequalities that characterized legitimate society. The common sailor on a buccaneer ship received 1 full share, far more relative to his officers than the common sailor in a naval or merchant vessel could ever hope to receive. The compensation for injuries that the articles provided was a form of insurance that had no parallel in the legitimate maritime world. A sailor who lost a limb in naval service was simply discharged, his career ended and his prospects grim. A sailor who lost a limb in buccaneer service received a substantial payment, enough to live on for years if managed carefully. The rates varied from crew to crew, but the principle was consistent. The community recognized its obligation to those who suffered in its service. The loss of a right arm, the most valuable limb for a right-handed sailor, commanded the highest compensation. The loss of a left arm was valued slightly less, as was the loss of a leg. Lesser injuries received lesser payments, the scale reflecting judgments about disability and its impact on earning capacity. The rules of conduct that the articles established maintained order in communities where violence was an occupational skill. Fighting among crew members was typically prohibited while aboard ship, the close quarters making any conflict dangerous to bystanders and to the vessel itself. Disputes were to be settled on shore, sometimes by formal duel with the crew watching to ensure fair play. The consumption of alcohol was regulated, not prohibited but controlled, the dangers of drunken sailors handling weapons and climbing rigging being obvious to anyone with experience. The treatment of prisoners was sometimes specified. captains who violated agreed-upon terms of surrender risking censure from their own crews. The democratic elements of buccaneer governance extended to major decisions that affected the entire crew. The choice of destinations, the selection of targets, the decision to attack or withdraw, all might be put to a vote in which every man had a voice. The captain's authority was significant but not unlimited. He commanded in battle and made tactical decisions, but strategic choices were collective. A captain who consistently led his crew to failure or who violated their trust could be deposed, replaced by someone the crew believed would serve them better. The accountability of leaders to lead was real. The consequences of poor leadership potentially fatal for the captain who disappointed his followers. The contrast between buccaneer democracy and the rigid hierarchies of legitimate maritime service was stark and attracted men who chafed under naval discipline. The Navy flogged sailors for minor infractions. The cat-o'-nine-tails applied to barebacks in punishments that could cripple or kill. The Navy pressed men into service against their will, the press gangs roaming port towns and kidnapping sailors who had no desire to serve. The Navy paid poorly and irregularly, the wages often months in arrears while officers lived comfortably on their superior shares. The buccaneer ship offered an alternative: democratic governance, fair division of profits, compensation for injuries, and the freedom to leave when a voyage ended. The choice was not difficult for men who had experienced both systems. The women who came to Tortuga occupied positions that reflected both their scarcity and their vulnerability. Some were wives in arrangements that the community recognized, their status providing protection, and their households providing domesticity that the bachelor pirates otherwise lacked. Some were prostitutes whose services were available to any man with money, their bodies commodified in transactions that were openly conducted. Some occupied ambiguous positions between these poles, relationships that might be temporary or might become permanent depending on circumstances. The women who survived in this male-dominated world developed skills of negotiation and self-protection that their circumstances required, finding whatever security the unstable environment could provide. The children born on Tortuga grew up in an environment unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the 17th century world. Their fathers were pirates, their mothers often women of uncertain status, their community one that operated by rules that legitimate society would have found incomprehensible. Some of these children followed their fathers into the trade, learning seamanship and violence as other children learned farming or crafts. Some left the island as soon as they could, seeking lives in places where their origins would not be known. The fate of most is unknown, their stories not recorded, their lives absorbed into the larger Caribbean population that formed as the buccaneer era ended, and more stable communities replaced the pirate havens. The ports that competed with Tortuga for the buccaneer trade each had their own character, the geography of Caribbean piracy shaped by multiple havens that offered different advantages. Port Royal in Jamaica was the largest and wealthiest, a proper city with thousands of residents and all the amenities that commerce could provide. The English colony of Jamaica had been captured from Spain in 1655, and its governors quickly recognized the value of the buccaneer trade, issuing commissions and collecting fees that enriched both the pirates and the colonial treasury. Port Royal grew rich on pirate spending, its merchants and tavern keepers and prostitutes accumulating fortunes that would have been impossible in more respectable communities. The island of New Providence in the Bahamas would later become another pirate haven, the Nassau that would host the famous pirates of the Golden Age in the early 18th century. But in the buccaneer era, Nassau was less developed than Tortuga or Port Royal, a minor base that lacked the infrastructure the pirates required. The Bahamas' time would come later, after the buccaneers had faded, and a new generation of pirates arose to terrorize Atlantic shipping. The continuity between the buccaneer era and the Golden Age was real but not direct, the later pirates inheriting traditions and techniques that the buccaneers had pioneered without maintaining organizational connections to the earlier communities. The coast of Central America offered temporary bases for buccaneers who wanted to operate close to the Spanish Main without returning to the established havens. The Mosquito Coast, the Caribbean shore of what is now Nicaragua and Honduras, was home to indigenous peoples who were hostile to Spain and willing to cooperate with Spain's enemies. The buccaneers found allies among these peoples, trading goods for provisions and information, using their territory as staging areas for raids against Spanish settlements. The alliance was mutually beneficial, the indigenous peoples gaining access to European weapons and goods, while the buccaneers gained local knowledge and safe harbours. The logwood trade that developed along the coasts of Central America provided legitimate cover for buccaneer activities, the valuable dyewood attracting English cutters who occupied territory that Spain claimed but could not control. The logwood cutters were often former buccaneers or men who combined logging with piracy as opportunity allowed. The settlements they established were rough and temporary, camps in the jungle that could be abandoned if Spanish forces approached and reoccupied when the danger passed. The logwood trade persisted for decades, the profits from the timber supplementing whatever could be earned from more adventurous activities. The rivers that flowed into the Caribbean provided routes for raids that penetrated deep into Spanish territory, the waterways allowing buccaneers to reach targets that seemed beyond their grasp. The rivers of Central America, particularly, offered access to towns and settlements that had never expected attack from the sea. The buccaneers who navigated these rivers required different skills than open-water sailors, the shallow drafts and narrow channels demanding small boats and careful navigation. The inland raids were particularly terrifying for their victims, the pirates appearing where they were least expected, demonstrating that distance from the coast provided no safety. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean coast, the Mosquito and others, became valuable allies for the buccaneers, their skills in hunting and fishing and navigation complementing the European skills in sailing and fighting. The Mosquito in particular became famous as harpooners, their ability to take sea turtles and manatees making them valuable additions to buccaneer crews. The alliance between Europeans and indigenous peoples was based on shared hostility to Spain, the common enemy creating cooperation that might not have existed otherwise. The indigenous peoples used the alliance to obtain weapons and goods that enhanced their own power, while the buccaneers used it to obtain local knowledge and labour that enhanced their effectiveness. The decline of the Mosquito alliance paralleled the decline of the buccaneer era, the changing political situation in Europe and the Caribbean reducing the value that each party provided to the other. The peace treaties that ended the wars between England and Spain removed the legal cover that had protected buccaneer activities, and the buccaneers who had operated under commission found themselves reclassified as pirates subject to prosecution. The indigenous peoples who had allied with the buccaneers found the alliance less valuable when the buccaneers themselves were being suppressed. The relationships that had sustained Caribbean piracy for decades dissolved as the conditions that had created them changed. The transformation of the Caribbean from a contested frontier to a collection of stable colonies occurred gradually over the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the wild era of the buccaneers giving way to the ordered exploitation of plantation agriculture. The sugar that made the Caribbean valuable required different conditions than piracy had required. Stable governments that could enforce property rights, labour forces that could be controlled and compelled to work, infrastructure that could support the processing and shipping of agricultural products. The planters who came to dominate Caribbean society had different interests than the buccaneers, and they used their growing political power to suppress the piracy that disrupted the commerce on which their profits depended. The suppression of piracy was never complete, the temptation too great and the opportunities too numerous for the trade to disappear entirely. The golden age of piracy that followed the buccaneer era demonstrated that changed conditions could produce new generations of pirates, men who exploited the gaps in colonial control that always existed. But the golden age was briefer than the buccaneer era. The powers that had once encouraged piracy now united in suppressing it. The pirates of the golden age were hunted more systematically than the buccaneers had been, the naval forces dedicated to their destruction more substantial and more persistent. The pirate havens that briefly flourished were closed more quickly, the governments that once had tolerated them now determined to eliminate them. The memory of Tortuga persisted even as the reality of the place declined, the stories of the pirate island becoming part of the mythology of the Caribbean. The writers who recorded buccaneer exploits created a literature that shaped how subsequent generations understood the era, their accounts mixing fact and fiction in proportions that readers could not always distinguish. Alexandre Quemelin's History of the Buccaneers, published in 1678, became the foundation for most later accounts, his first-hand knowledge combined with embellishments that made for better storytelling. The image of Tortuga that emerges from these accounts is partly historical and partly legendary, the actual place transformed by imagination into something more colourful and more coherent than reality had been. The artistic representations of Tortuga have multiplied over the centuries, each generation reinterpreting the pirate island according to its own tastes and concerns. The illustrations that accompanied early printed accounts showed scenes of violence and debauchery that both horrified and fascinated European readers. The paintings that depicted buccaneer life in later centuries added romantic elements that the original accounts had lacked, the pirates becoming heroic figures rather than mere criminals. The films that brought Tortuga to 20th century audiences created visual images that have become inseparable from the historical place, the cinematic Tortuga replacing the actual one in popular imagination. The video games that allow players to visit virtual versions of Tortuga represent the latest iteration of this long tradition, interactive entertainment that lets audiences participate in pirate adventures rather than merely observe them. The games draw on the accumulated imagery of centuries, combining historical elements with fantasy in ways that create engaging experiences without much concern for accuracy. The Tortuga of these games is a place where players can live out pirate fantasies, capturing ships and accumulating treasure in worlds that respond to their choices. The connection to historical Tortuga is thin but real, the games building on a foundation that the buccaneers unknowingly laid 4 centuries ago. The scholarly study of Tortuga and the buccaneer era continues to produce new insights, researchers examining the surviving evidence with methods and questions that earlier generations did not bring. The archives that contain documents from the period have been searched more thoroughly, court records and colonial correspondence revealing details that fill gaps in the historical narrative. The underwater archaeology that has developed in recent decades offers the possibility of recovering material evidence that documents alone cannot provide. The interdisciplinary approaches that modern scholarship favours bring perspectives from economics, sociology, gender studies, and other fields to bear on questions that traditional history addressed only partially. The questions that remain unanswered about Tortuga and its buccaneers are numerous, the evidence too fragmentary to resolve every puzzle. How many men actually lived and worked on the island at its peak? What were the specific routes through which stolen goods reached legitimate markets? How did individual buccaneers understand and justify their actions to themselves? What happened to the wealth that flowed through the island, and does any of it survive in retrievable form? These questions may never be answered definitively, the sources that could resolve them lost or never created in the first place. The uncertainty is part of what makes the subject fascinating, the gaps in knowledge leaving room for imagination to operate. The island sleeps beneath the Caribbean stars, the same stars that watched over the buccaneers and their victims, the same stars that will watch over whatever comes next. The waves continue their endless rhythm against the shore, the sound that has accompanied every human presence on Tortuga, and that will continue after humans are gone. The history that unfolded here was brief in the scale of geological time, a few decades of human activity that seemed important to those involved, but that the universe noticed not at all. The pirates who built their kingdom on this rock believed they were making history, and in a sense they were, but the history they made has become legend, and the legend has become entertainment, and the entertainment will eventually be forgotten too. The only permanence is the island itself, and even that is temporary, the rock slowly eroding into the sea that surrounds it, returning eventually to the elements from which it formed. The Caribbean keeps its secrets, the sea and the islands and the sky holding memories that they do not share. Rest now and let the darkness carry you where it will. Good night.